Enter, seeker of shadows. You stand at the threshold of the Dark Whisper Society. Here, the horror author Dark Monarch's voice drips like scripture, offering fragments too dangerous for the anthologies. Whispers that coil around your soul and refuse to let go. These are not full resurrections, but temptations. Bait for the faithful. A taste of the eternal night that waits in the books. The society welcomes you, but the true covenant lies beyond in the pages. Subscribe and hype now to hear these forbidden tales. And when you're ready for the full descent, the books await to take you deeper. Link to Dark Monarch ebook and paperback in the description box. Enjoy the story. Chapter 1. The Stain of Absolution. The oak of the confessional booth had been polished by 2 centuries of use, worn smooth not by harsh scrubbing, but by the nervous weight of human sorrow. It was the color of dried blood and old wine, and it hummed with an invisible psychic weight, the accumulated burden of 10,000 sins released into the thin, dusty air. Father Thomas, a man whose spine was habitually bowed by the weight of his duties and whose eyes held the perpetual shadow of too much shared misery, hated the Tuesday night shift. It was the longest, the quietest, and the air always felt particularly thick, as if the physical act of forgiveness had somehow failed, leaving the guilt suspended like spiritual soot. Tonight was worse. He sat on his side of the partition, the heavy violet curtain drawn behind him, the small, high window of the booth letting in only the feeble, orange glow of the street lamp outside. He could smell the stale perfume and faint perspiration of the woman in the penitent stall, Mrs. Albright, a kind, anxious soul who usually confessed to speeding on the highway or taking 2 communion wafers by accident. He slid open the wooden grill. The scent of her expensive moisturizer washed over him. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," Mrs. Albright whispered, her voice a brittle thread. "It has been 3 weeks since my last confession. And what sins do you wish to confess now, child?" Father Thomas asked, his voice low, trained to be both warm and utterly impersonal. She listed the usual things: an unkind thought about a neighbor's dog, a moment of impatience with her husband, failing to say her rosary before bed. Thomas listened, tapping the edge of his stole lightly. Routine. Forgiveness by rote. Then she paused. A long, unnatural pause. "Is that all, my child?" he prompted gently. A terrible, soft sound came from the other side. It wasn't a sob. It was a choked, gasping hiss like air escaping a sealed crypt. "Father," Mrs. Albright finally managed, her voice now raw, stripped of all suburban composure. The booth had said something. Father Thomas frowned, adjusting his spectacles. The booth. "My dear, perhaps you are overtired." The old wood often creaks. "No, not a creak. It was a whisper, Father, right next to my ear. It said..." She clamped her hand over her mouth, her breathing ragged. "It said what, child? Tell me." She squeezed her eyes shut. It said, "Did the doctor truly deserve the full dose of morphine you gave him, Mrs. Albright? After what he said about your daughter?" A sudden, freezing wave of clarity washed over Father Thomas. The air in the tiny booth became instantly colder, pressing in on him. Mrs. Albright's daughter, Amy, had died in the hospital 3 months ago. The doctor had been quietly sanctioned, but the cause was listed as a medical incident. No one outside the family, and perhaps the police, knew the full, dark truth of the why. And certainly, no one had confessed murder. "Mrs. Albright," Thomas began, keeping his tone level by sheer force of priestly will, "I believe you are under great stress." "I didn't confess it, Father. I only confessed the speeding," she cried, the terror now boiling over. "The booth knew. It knew what I did to Dr. Harrison. It said his name." Thomas leaned closer to the grill, his breath catching in the sudden, absolute silence that followed. He could hear nothing on the other side but her frantic, shallow breathing. Then he heard a new sound. It wasn't human. It was a soft, dry rasp, emanating not from the partition, but from the wood itself. It was low, like a breath drawn through ancient lint. She brought the sleeping pills from home, Father, crushed into the iced tea, and she smiled. The voice was multiple and singular, ancient and immediate, 1,000 voices speaking through a pinhole. It was the sound of secrets decomposing. Mrs. Albright screamed, a thin, high sound of pure, panicked guilt. The curtain on her side tore open as she bolted from the stall. Thomas flinched back, scrambling out of his own side of the booth. He heard the frenzied clack, clack, clack of her heels fading down the aisle. He stood alone in the dim sanctuary, his vestments feeling suddenly heavy and suffocating. The air was stale, but underneath the incense and dust was something metallic, something cold. He approached the confessional booth slowly, as if it were a beast curled up in the corner. He reached out and touched the oak of the central partition. It was cold, too cold for the heated church. He slid open the grill to the penitent's side. "Who is there?" he demanded, his voice echoing flatly in the empty chamber. "Who speaks?" Silence. Only the faint tick of the cooling radiator. He was about to write it off. A shared delusion, a creak of old wood magnified by a grieving woman's guilt, when his gaze fell upon the small, velvet kneeler where Mrs. Albright had been kneeling. Embedded in the crimson velvet, just barely visible, was a single, perfect droplet of moisture. It wasn't tear fluid, it was thick and viscous. As he knelt, his heart hammering against his ribs, he saw that the drop had formed a tiny, black stain, smelling faintly of old wood smoke. And next to it, where the partition met the floor, was a single dry splinter. It was long and thin, like a needle of black ash. As Thomas reached for it, the splinter didn't crumble. It moved, just slightly, catching the light like an insect leg. He didn't touch it. He snatched his hand back. Then, from the grill he had left open, came the whisper, weaker now, but utterly distinct. "The truth sets them free, Thomas. I only speak the truth. Now, I require the offering." The cold deepened. Father Thomas, the man of God, the keeper of secrets, felt a terrible, heretical certainty. The ancient, silent wooden box had not merely remembered sin. It had claimed it, and now it was awake and hungry. He had granted absolution, but the booth had levied a tax, and he was the only priest left to pay it. Chapter 2. The Archive of Guilt. Father Thomas did not immediately run after Mrs. Albright. He couldn't. His legs felt like lead weights, and his priestly instinct, honed by decades of dealing with human catastrophe, told him that frantic motion would solve nothing. He needed context. He needed to know what profane presence had violated the sanctity of his church. His first move was a terrible, sacrilegious necessity. He fetched his tools from the sacristy, a small inspection light, a thin metal probe used for cleaning candle wax, and a set of master keys. He returned to the confessional, his cassock whispering against the marble floor of the deserted sanctuary. The main lights remained off, leaving the high arches of St. Jude's shrouded in oppressive darkness. The examination. He approached the booth again, this time ignoring the chilling cold radiating from the dark oak. He locked the main confessional doors, guaranteeing privacy. He slipped into the penitent's side, shining the beam of his inspection light over the interior. The compartment was small, cramped, and smelled intensely of Mrs. Albright's fear. He checked the partition. The grill was simply a lattice of dark, heavy wood covered on the penitent's side by a thin, woven cloth designed to muffle the voice and prevent eye contact. Thomas ran his hand along the oak. It felt utterly solid, yet the surface seemed impossibly fine, like polished bone. He used the metal probe, sliding it gently between the gaps in the grill and the frame. He was looking for a speaker, a recording device, any human source of the voices. Nothing. The probe struck only solid wood, a tight, perfect seal. He focused his beam on the kneeler again. The spot where the dark, viscous drop had fallen was still moist, and the stain now looked less like ink and more like a patch of charred velvet. He carefully lifted the kneeler. The wood beneath was deeply grooved, as if scored repeatedly by heavy tools. He moved to the small, wooden shelf where the penitents placed their hands. He ran his fingers along the underside. He felt a slight irregularity. Using the master key, he carefully unlocked and removed the small, narrow panel that formed the lower section of the door. He peered into the hollow space between the outer wall of the confessional and the interior paneling. It was choked with dust, a fine, dark powder that looked like ground charcoal. And within the dust, something else, hundreds of tiny, brittle scrolls. He pulled one out gingerly. It was a sliver of paper, no larger than his thumbnail, rolled so tightly it resembled a dried seed pod. He unrolled it under the beam of his flashlight. The script was agonizingly small, written in faded, rust-colored ink. It was Latin, Itida hoc peccato nescio quat facere, and of this sin I do not know what to do. It was a fragment of a forgotten confession, a desperate cry for guidance, meticulously transcribed and stored. He pulled out another, then another. They were all there, small, silent records of human failings, slipped through cracks and crevices by priests over the centuries, perhaps, who had meticulously recorded the most grievous sins to remember them for future penance, or perhaps by penitents who had written their shame to release it. An involuntary, unauthorized archive of every dark corner of the human soul that had ever sought shelter here. But the paper felt old, impossibly old. Yet the Latin phrases were fresh, vibrant with desperate, living emotion. Thomas looked up at the main partition again, his terror escalating. The booth wasn't just a container for secrets, it was a collector. The wood hadn't been whispering the sins of Mrs. Albright. It had been reading the catalog, matching her inner guilt to the archive of universal human sin it contained. But how did it know her specific details? He exited the penitent's stall and moved to the priest's side. He noticed something he had overlooked for 20 years. Where his left hand habitually rested on the oak ledge, there was a series of faint, almost invisible striations in the wood grain. They looked like minute, petrified scratches. He put his ear close to the wood. It was silent, but he could feel a low-frequency thrum, a vibration like a sleeping animal's heart. Then, from the darkness of the sanctuary, where the altar was lost in shadow, he heard a sound, the whisper of air moving across the polished floor. He whirled around, light beams stabbing the darkness. Nothing, but the grill to the penitent's side, which he had left slightly ajar, was now fully closed. He knew, with a certainty that froze his blood, that something had entered the booth while he was searching it. The offering. Thomas reached for the grill. Before he could touch it, the multi-voice whisper returned, stronger now, laced with a strange, demanding authority. The archivist demands sustenance, Thomas. The cost of clarity is steep. What do you want? Thomas gasped, stepping back, hands instinctively raising the cross hanging from his chest. Not blood, not gold. You mistake the nature of my hunger. The voice was closer now, not from the grill, but from the wood right next to his ear, where the small ledge was located. I am the vessel of released shame. When a sin is confessed and forgiven, the spirit of that darkness is meant to depart. But here, the spirit is captured, a stain in the wood. It is bound by the priest's act of absolution, yet it is never truly released. It is a debt. The voice grew heavy, accusatory. The collection is full. I require a new payment, a new binding. You must bring me a pure offering, a new, unburdened soul, that I may claim its potential sin before it is ever confessed, before it is ever known. Thomas felt the nausea rise. You are asking for a sacrifice of innocence. I ask for balance, a blank slate to absorb the overflow of the archive. Bring the child of the church, the one who stands on the verge. Thomas knew exactly who it meant. Michael, the 10-year-old altar boy, a boy of perfect, almost unnerving sincerity, who saw the church not as a building, but as the living heart of God. Michael was scheduled to be confirmed next month, a rite of passage, a final step in a true accountability and sin. I will not violate a child of God for a demon. Thomas shouted, his voice echoing in the vast, empty church. The wood of the confessional booth shuddered. The vibration was violent, rattling the wooden grill. The air became instantly dry, tasting of ancient spice and ash. The whisper was now a high, chilling drone, a sound of ecstatic, consuming hunger. Then I will take the payment myself, Father, and I will begin with the unconfessed sin of Thomas, the hypocrite. A wave of intense, searing heat erupted from the wooden ledge where Thomas's hand had rested. He cried out, pulling back, clutching his burned hand. Then the grill on his side slowly, deliberately slid shut, locking him into total darkness. And from the darkness, a new whisper, tailored precisely for him, low and intimate. Remember the hospital parking lot, Thomas? And the blood on the asphalt? Remember the man you let bleed out because you could not stop your car? The confessional had claimed the priest, sealing him in the archive of his own guilt. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Redemption. The darkness was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Locked inside the priest's compartment of the confessional, Father Thomas felt the cold radiating not just from the wood, but from the spiritual void the entity represented. His burned hand throbbed, a physical reminder of the heat generated by his own unconfessed sin being dragged into the light. Remember the sound of the siren, Thomas, growing fainter as you sped away? Remember the lie you told the patrolman about taking a detour? The intimate whisper hissed, vibrating in the fibers of his cassock. The man you left on the asphalt was Father Michael, your predecessor, and you drove past his dying plea because you were late for your own installation mass. Your ministry is founded on murder and hypocrisy. The accusation was precise, damning, and paralyzing. It wasn't just guilt, it was spiritual gravity dragging him down. The escape. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, forcing his mind to reject the narrative of shame. He was a priest, not just a man. He had duties beyond his personal failings. He was trapped in an object, and objects could be dismantled. The physical. He had to rely on the architecture of the church, the centuries of human effort that went into creating a structure designed to contain and thus resist the very darkness that now besieged it. He reached into the pocket of his cassock with his good hand. He pulled out the master key ring and, more importantly, a pocket knife. A practical tool he used for cutting flower stems and opening boxes, now repurposed for desperate measures. He aimed the point of the knife at the seam of the heavy oak door he had entered through. It was locked from the outside by a simple bolt, which was now sliding open and closed randomly, playing a cruel, metallic rhythm against his rising fear. He began working the blade into the jamb, searching for the mechanism. The wood around him thrummed violently, attempting to distract him. Futility, Thomas. I am the wood. I am the silence. You confess your sins to me, and perhaps I grant you ease. Thomas ignored it, focusing on the small, silver gleam of the bolt. He found the sweet spot, jammed the blade in, and shoved hard. Clack! The bolt snapped, and Thomas threw himself against the heavy door. It burst open, sending him tumbling out onto the cold marble floor of the sanctuary. He scrambled back, his eyes darting toward the confessional. It stood silent and massive in the gloom, looking utterly inert, yet somehow radiating malice. The search for the source. His physical escape was temporary. The entity wanted the altar boy, Michael, the child of the church. He had to understand what the booth was before it could mobilize. Thomas rose, grabbing his flashlight. He ignored the archival scrolls he'd left on the floor and rushed not to the front entrance, but toward the archives and the foundation. He moved through the vestry, past the rows of white linen and gold-threaded stoles, and descended the narrow, damp stone steps into the church crypt and cellar. The air down here was musty, thick with the smell of mold and earth, but it felt cleaner, simpler, just cold, damp rock, free of the concentrated spiritual taint upstairs. He found the church archives, a precarious stack of brittle, leather-bound ledgers detailing the history of the parish. He found the ledger for the year 1873, when St. Jude's had been extensively renovated and the confessional booth installed. The entry was written in flowing, copperplate script by the then current priest, Father Elias. The new box, constructed of salvaged oak. I am told the wood came from the dismantled gallows tree of the old county courthouse. A strange choice for the vessel of God's forgiveness, but the cost was agreeable, and the grain of the oak is remarkably dark and fine. Thomas stopped reading, his blood chilling to ice. A gallows tree, an instrument of state execution, steeped in the final panic, despair, and the absolute, unrepentant guilt of the condemned. The spirit of the wood wasn't an ancient demon. It was the residue of judgment and death, overlaid with centuries of repressed sin. He flipped the pages frantically, looking for Father Elias's later notes. An entry 6 months later. A disturbing malaise has fallen over the parish. The parishioners confess less, and when they do, their repentance feels thin, almost forced. And the whispers, they all speak of whispers. I fear the provenance of the wood has proven too dark a burden for even God's light to fully purify. I have commissioned the stone masons to line the interior base of the box with consecrated lead, attempting to seal the taint within the earth. Thomas dropped the book. Lead, a containment measure. He didn't need the book anymore. He needed the basement of the confessional. He raced through the crypt, navigating between the tombs of long-dead bishops, until he stood beneath the exact spot where the confessional rested on the floor above. Here, the stone was rougher, older. He played his light over the floor. He saw the seam. A small, square section of the stone floor, directly beneath the booth, was distinct. It had clearly been cut and sealed at a later date. He knelt, running his fingers over the seal. It was covered in a thick layer of cement. The air here was suddenly different. It was freezing, and the electrical humming sound he had heard in the booth above was deafening here. The entity was below him, trying to break the seal. He grabbed a heavy, rusted fire poker used for maintaining the furnace and began striking the sealed square. The sound echoed deafeningly in the crypt, a frantic, rhythmic clang of metal on stone. Crack! The cement cracked. He pried away a piece, revealing the metallic lining Father Elias had written about, a thick sheet of dull, consecrated lead. He worked faster, stripping away the cement and revealing more of the lead sheeting. As he did, the temperature in the basement plummeted further, and the air began to smell intensely of ozone and ash. He was exposing the entity's bindings. Stop! You violate the sanctuary. I am the keeper now. The whisper screamed, no longer focused on his sin, but on self-preservation. Thomas ripped away the last piece of cement, revealing the full square of the lead seal. The metal was not smooth. It was bubbling and warping, as if reacting violently to a powerful, concentrated electrical charge from beneath. The noise was unbearable. He thrust the rusted poker, point first, through the blistered lead, breaching the seal. A sickening sound like wet paper tearing burst from the hole. A thick, dark smoke erupted, smelling intensely of rotten meat and burnt hair. It was a suffocating cloud of pure, stored malice. The smoke coalesced, not into a demon, but into a swirling vortex of black script and tiny paper fragments. It was the physical manifestation of the archival scrolls, the thousands of sins released at once. The black cloud lunged, not toward Thomas, but toward the stairwell. The child, the offering, the balance must be paid. Thomas knew he was too late to stop the spiritual escape, but he had one chance left. He grabbed a small, bronze, holy water font from the wall. He roared and threw the entire contents, water, dust, and bronze, directly at the retreating smoke cloud. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The smoke shrieked, a sound of agony and violation. The holy water didn't cleanse it. It seemed to ignite the darkness. But even as the cloud recoiled, half dissipated, a final, chilling whisper trailed back from the stairwell, triumphant. "Too late, Thomas. The offering is found. Listen for the sound of the bell." Epilogue: The price of silence. The police investigation was brief and yielded no answers. They found Mrs. Albright 3 blocks away, curled under a juniper bush in a state of catatonic terror, whispering the name of the dead Dr. Harrison over and over. She was admitted to a psychiatric facility, her testimony dismissed as the delusion of grief and stress. They found Father Thomas in the basement crypt, bruised and covered in soot, standing over the scorched, bubbling lead seal. He claimed a pipe burst, causing a small electrical fire and smoke damage. He would not speak of the whispers, the archive, or the gallows tree. He had learned the terrifying lesson. The truth, sometimes, was a sin best kept silent. The most tragic casualty was the altar boy, Michael. Michael had arrived early for the morning service, excited about setting up the altar. When Father Thomas finally emerged, shaken and covered in ash, he found the boy kneeling in the center aisle, directly in front of the confessional booth. The booth stood pristine, silent, and massive. Michael wasn't crying, nor was he panicked. He was simply kneeling, utterly immobile, his small hands clasped in prayer. When Thomas reached him, the boy looked up, and the priest felt his stomach drop away. The light in Michael's eyes, the pure, earnest sincerity that Thomas had cherished, was gone. It had been replaced by a look of profound, exhausted knowledge. The eyes of an ancient, weary soul who had just seen every hidden cruelty the human heart could conjure. "Father Thomas," Michael whispered, his voice flat. "I know everything now." "Michael, my son, what do you know?" "The secrets," the boy said. "I know why the gardener left his wife. I know where the collection money went last year. I know about the man in the hospital parking lot." The entity had not physically harmed the boy. It had simply poured the entire archive of the church's guilt into his mind, overloading his innocence. It had taken the pure offering and made him its living repository. The payment had been the destruction of his beautiful, necessary naivete. Michael was institutionalized soon after, diagnosed with severe dissociative trauma. Father Thomas remained the parish priest of St. Jude's. The confessional booth was deemed structurally unsound due to the water damage in the crypt. It was sealed with new oak planks, bolted shut, and permanently decommissioned. It stood against the wall, a vast, silent, and terrifying monument. But silence is not absence. Thomas now knows that the sins are not gone. They are simply waiting. They are contained, but still potent, like poison stored in a gilded jar. He performs his priestly duties, his heart heavy with the secret of his murdered predecessor and the knowledge of his own unatoned sin. He offers Mass, he blesses the congregation, and he preaches forgiveness. But every week, when he moves the flower arrangements near the sealed booth, he pauses. He does not hear the loud, demanding whispers of before. Instead, he hears a new sound, a constant, low, rhythmic sound emanating from the heavy oak planks. It is the sound of tiny, brittle paper scrolls being quietly created and written on the inside. The confessional is no longer seeking absolution. It is simply keeping notes. And the notes, Thomas knows, are waiting for the day the seal finally fails and the archive comes due.